Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We're starting a new book today, and it is Treasures in the Snow by Patricia St. John with permission of Moody Publishing Company. But before I start reading the book, I want to read a note from the author. When I was a child of 7, I went to live in Switzerland. My home was a chalet on the mountain above the village where I had imagined Annette and Danny to live. Like them, I went to the village school on a sled by moonlight and helped to make hay in summer. I followed the cows up the mountain and slept in the hay. I went to church on Christmas Eve to see the tree covered with oranges and gingerbread bears and was taken to visit the doctor in town up the valley. Claus was my own white kitty, given to me by a farmer, and my baby brothers rode in a milk cart behind the great St. Bernard dog. But all this was over 20 years ago, and I've been back only as a visitor. Switzerland today is probably very different. I expect it would be impossible now for a child to miss school for any length of time, and no doubt the medical service has improved. Perhaps all the little villages have their own doctors now. I do not know. But I do know that today, as 20 years ago, the little school and the church still stand. The cowbells still tinkle in the valley, and the narcissus still scent the fields in May. And I hope that little children still sing carols under the tree at Christmas, and love their gingerbread bears as much as I loved mine. I have not given the village its proper name because, for the sake of the story, I have added one or two things that are not really there. For instance, there is no town nearby that could not be reached except by the pass. But otherwise, I have tried to keep it true to life. And if you ever go to Switzerland and take an electric train from Montreal, you will stop at a tiny station where the hayfields bound the platform and high green hills rise up behind, dotted with chalets. To the right of the railway, the banks drop down into a foaming, rushing river, beyond which the mountains rise again, and between a long green mountain and a rocky pointed mountain there lays a pass. If added to all this, you see a low white school building not far from the station, and a wooden church spire rising from behind a hillock, you will know that this is the village where this story was born. Patricia St. John, 1950. Now let's start Chapter 1, Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Eve, and 3 people were climbing the steep white mountainside. The moonlight threw shadows behind them across the snow. The middle one was a woman in a long skirt with dark cloak over her shoulders. Clinging to her hand was a black-haired boy of 6 who talked all the time with his mouth full. Walking a little way away from them, with her eyes turned to the stars, was a girl of 7. Her hands were folded across her chest. Close to her heart, she carried a golden gingerbread bear with eyes made with white icing. The little boy also had a gingerbread bear, but he had eaten it all except the back legs. He looked at the girl spitefully. "Mine was bigger than yours," he said. The girl did not seem upset. "I would not change it," she replied calmly without turning her head. Then she looked down again with eyes full of love at her beautiful bear in her arms. How solid he looked, how delicious he smelled, and how brightly he gleamed in the starlight. She would never eat him. Never. 80 little village children had been given gingerbread bears, but hers had surely been by far the most beautiful. Yes, she would keep him forever in memory of tonight. And whenever she looked at him, she would remember Christmas Eve, the frosty blue sky, and the warm glow of the lighted church, the tree decorated with silver stars, the carols, the crib, the sweet, sad story of Christmas. It made her want to cry when she thought about the inn where there was no room. She would have opened her door wide and welcomed Mary and Joseph in. Lucien, the boy, was annoyed by her silence. "I have nearly finished mine," he remarked, scowling. "Let me taste yours, Annette." "You have not started it." But Annette shook her head and held her bear a little closer. "I'm never going to eat him," she replied. "I'm going to keep him forever and ever." They had come to where the crumbling white path divided, and a few yards along the right fork stood a group of chalets with lights shining in their windows and dark barns standing behind them. Annette was nearly home. Madame Moret hesitated. "Are you all right to go home alone, Annette?" she asked, doubtfully. "Or shall we take you to the door?" "Oh, I would much rather go home alone," answered Annette, "and thank you for taking me. Good night, madam. Good night, Lucien." She turned and ran, in case madam should change her mind and insist on seeing her to the door. She so badly wanted to be alone. She wanted to get away from Lucien's chatter and enjoy the silence of the night. How could she think and look at the stars when she was having to make polite replies to Madame Morel and Lucien? She had never been out alone at night before, and even this was a sort of an accident. She was supposed to have gone to church on the sleigh with her parents. They had been thinking about it and planning for it for weeks. But this morning her mother had taken ill, and her father had gone off to the midday train to fetch the doctor from town up the valley. The doctor had arrived about tea time, but he could not cure her in time to get up and go to church as Annette had hoped he would. So, to her great disappointment, she had to go instead with Madame Morel from the chalet up the hill. But when she had reached the church, it was so beautiful that she had forgotten everything but the tree and the magic of Christmas, and so it had not mattered so much at all. The magic stayed with her, and now as she stood alone among the snow and the stars, it seemed a pity to go in just yet and break the spell. She hesitated as she reached the steps leading up to the balcony and looked around. Just opposite loomed the cowshed. Annette could hear the beast moving and munching from the manger. An exciting idea struck her, and she made up her mind in a moment, darting across the sleigh tracks and lifted the latch of the door. The warm smell of cattle and milk and hay greeted her as she slipped inside. She wiggled against the leg of the chestnut-colored cow and wormed her way into the hayrack. The cow was having supper, but Annette flew her arms around its neck and let it go on munching, just as cows must have munched when Mary sat among them when her newborn baby was in her arms. She looked down at the manger and imagined baby Jesus was lying in the straw with the cows, still and quiet, worshiping about him. Through a hole in the roof she could see one bright star, and she remembered how a star had shone over Bethlehem and guided the wise men to the house where Jesus lay. She could imagine them paddling up the valley on their swaying camels, and suddenly, any moment now, the door would open softly, and the shepherds would come creeping in with little lambs in their arms and offer to cover the child with woolly fleeces. As she leaned further, a great feeling of pity came over her for the homeless baby who had had all the doors shut against him. "There would be plenty of room in our chalet," she whispered, "and yet perhaps after all this is the nicest place. The hay is sweet and clean. Louise's breath is warm and pleasant. Maybe God chose the best cradle for his baby after all." She might have stayed there dreaming all night if it had not been for the gleam of the lantern through the half-open door of the shed, and the sound of firm, crunching footsteps in the snow. Then she heard her father call her in a quick, hurried voice. She slipped down from the rack and dodged Louise's tail and ran out with wide-opened arms. "I went in to wish the cows a happy Christmas," she said, laughing. "Did you come out to find me?" "Yes, I did," he replied, but he was not laughing. His face was pale and serious in the moonlight, and he took her hand and almost dragged her up the steps. "You should have come in at once with your mother so ill. She's been asking for you for half an hour." Annette suddenly felt very sorry, for somehow the Christmas tree had made her forget about everything else, and all the time her mother, whom she loved so much, was lying ill and wanting her. She had thought the doctor would have made her better. She took her hand from her father's and ran up the wooden stairs and into her mother's bedroom. Neither the doctor nor the village nurse saw her until she had crept up to the bed, for she was a small, slim child who moved almost silently. But her mother saw her, half held out her arms. Annette, without a word, ran into them and hid her face on her mother's shoulder. She began to cry quietly, for her mother's face was almost as white as the pillow, and it frightened her. Besides, she felt sorry for having been away so long. "Annette," whispered her mother, "stop crying. I have a present for you." Annette stopped at once. A present? Of course, it was Christmas. and she had quite forgotten. Her mother always gave her a present, but she usually had it on New Year's Day. Whatever could it be? She looked around expectantly. Her mother turned to the nurse. "Give it to her," she whispered. The nurse pulled back the blanket and lifted out a bundle wrapped in a white shawl. She came over to Annette and held it out to her. "Your little brother," the nurse explained. "Let us go down by the fire and you shall rock his cradle. We must leave your mother to sleep. Kiss her good night." "Your little brother," echoed her mother's weak voice. "He's yours, Annette. Bring him up and love him. Look after him for me. I give him to you." Her voice trailed away and she closed her eyes. Annette, too dazed to speak, allowed herself to be led downstairs by the nurse. She sat down on a stool by the stove to rock the wooden cradle where her Christmas present lay covered in shawls and blankets. She sat very still for a long time, staring at the bump that was her little brother. The house was very still, and the Christmas star shone in through the windows. It had shone on that other Christmas baby in the stable in the Bethlehem, or Mary sitting watching God's little son, just as she was sitting by the stove watching her little brother. She put out gentle fingers and touched the top of his downy head, which was all she could see of him. Then, with a tired sigh, she leaned her head against the cradle and let her imagination go where it would. Stars and shepherds, little new babies, shut doors, wise men, gingerbread bears. They all became muddled up in her mind, and she slid gradually onto the floor. It was there that her father found her an hour later, lying as peacefully asleep as her new little baby brother, her bright head resting on the cradle rocker. "Poor little motherless creatures," he said as he stooped down to pick her up. "How shall I ever bring them up without her?" For Annette's mother had gone to spend Christmas in heaven. Tomorrow we have Chapter 2, Grandmother Arrives. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.